In the scorching heart of the Sahel, a bewildering image traveled the world trucks, unloading tons of watermelons, buried one by one in the blistering desert sands. To many international observers, it looked like sheer madness. How could a country marked by famine and drought discard food to toss it back into the earth? But in Burkina Faso, under the firm leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, the act was not seen as waste, but as a challenge. A silent scream against decades of dependence. A radical gesture to say that sovereignty can sprout even from what the world despises. This is no ordinary account. It is the story of a people who dared to face ridicule, to reclaim their dignity. It is proof that behind the green rind of a fruit, the seed of a revolution might be hidden. Stay with me because what seemed senseless may reveal the future of an entire region. If you believe that the true transformation of Africa has already begun, subscribe and follow this narrative to the end. The so-called Oasis project began with a gesture that was both symbolic and practical, burying watermelons in the parched soil of the Sahel. At first glance, the idea seemed absurd. However, there was science behind the audacity. Watermelons, composed of about 90% water, also carry potassium, magnesium, calcium, and carbon-rich fibers. When they decompose, they turn into underground reservoirs, capable of feeding microorganisms, retaining moisture, and giving life back to lands that had long forgotten how to flourish. The first trials in Burkina Faso revealed clear contrasts. In plots where the technique was not used, moisture evaporated in a few days. In the fields where watermelons were buried, the moisture remained for up to 2 weeks. There, shoots of millet and sorghum germinated more quickly, sending deep roots in search of the new water reserve. The soil, previously arid and sterile, was beginning to breathe again. At the same time, the project offered an answer to another chronic problem: agricultural waste. Every year, tons of watermelons rot in West African markets with no buyer and no destination. Transforming this surplus into fertility reservoirs meant giving a new purpose to what was previously inevitable loss. What looked like an act of desperation began to be perceived as a strategic proposal. However, this was only the surface of the story. What came next would show that the Oasis project was not just about agriculture, but about politics, sovereignty, and a direct confrontation with a global system. As the first news about the Oasis project spread through Burkina Faso, society plunged into a wave of heated debates. In rural villages near the test sites, children laughed and applauded each buried fruit, singing improvised songs about planting water. For some elders, the gesture seemed to echo ancient rituals when milk or grains were offered to the earth to ask for rain. There was therefore a sense of reunion with forgotten traditions, now cloaked in the language of science. But in the cities, especially in Ouagadougou, reactions were harsher. Market vendors protested, claiming that hundreds of watermelons, even if damaged, could have been sold at low prices to hungry families. Mothers questioned on radio programs, "How can we bury food when our children still go to bed hungry?" These critical voices set the tone for a country divided between hope and indignation. Then, the unexpected happened. 2 weeks after the first burials, small green patches began to emerge where only sterile sand had been before. Shoots of millet and cowpea broke through the hard soil, turning disbelief into astonishment. Local farmers touched the earth and declared that it felt alive again. The image of the shoots quickly circulated on social media, becoming a symbol of rebirth. What was ridiculed began to be observed with seriousness. Initial success sparked interest beyond the borders. In Mali, community radios opened microphones to discuss whether the same could be done with baobab pulp or peanut shells. In Niger, agronomy students organized forums calling the experiment "the science of the poor for the poor." In Chad community, leaders saw the gesture as a metaphor for hope. If Burkina Faso can plant water, we can plant the future too. The collective emotion reached a turning point. The Sahel began to see the Oasis project not just as a technique, but as a movement. While the fields of Burkina Faso began to display green shoots, the world reacted in contrasting ways. In the Western press, the tone was one of contempt. French newspapers published caricatures of peasants throwing fruit into the desert, and British anchors classified the initiative as a spectacle of despair. American analysts were even harsher. They called the project unsustainable, a political distraction that did not tackle the country's real problems. But in other parts of the globe, the narrative was different. Russian channels hailed Ibrahim Traoré as a daring leader, comparing the strategy to Russia's resistance in times of sanctions. Chinese agricultural magazines praised the idea as an ingenious way to recycle organic waste. The Turkish press highlighted the cultural value of the gesture, seeing in it the fusion between modern science and ancient African traditions. The same act that was ridiculed in Paris became inspiring in Moscow, Beijing, and Ankara. It was in this scenario that the most explosive revelation emerged. An internal memo from a European Agricultural Trade Association came to light. The document admitted in an alarmed tone that if the buried watermelon method proved effective, the demand for imported fertilizers could collapse across West Africa. Billions in contracts, supply chains, and political influence would be at risk, all threatened by a fruit buried in the sand. The news ignited the debate. Critics accused the government of using watermelons to cover up flaws in food distribution. Opposition politicians demanded inquiries. In the streets of Ouagadougou, protesters raised placards asking, "Is it a promise of the future or well-rehearsed theater?" The tension was rising, but along with it, the conviction that something bigger was at stake was also growing. The Oasis project stopped being a simple agricultural experiment. It became a symbolic battlefield where the dignity of a people confronted the consolidated interests of economic empires. Within Burkina Faso, the Oasis project began to transform not only the soil, but also the daily lives of communities. Farmers who previously depended on expensive imported fertilizers discovered that they could reduce production costs by up to 20% by taking advantage of local agricultural waste. This saving for families already pressured by poverty meant money available for medicine, school supplies, and small improvements to homes. What was once seen as a trick with fruit was revealing itself to be a real relief for family budgets. Women played a central role in this change. In several regions, they organized cooperatives to collect damaged fruit from markets and direct it to the project's pits. With training in composting techniques, they learned to combine the watermelon pulp with crop residues, creating richer and longer-lasting fertilizers. By selling seedlings and homemade fertilizers to neighboring villages, they generated a new source of income. This network of women's cooperatives not only bolstered the local economy, but also strengthened the role of women as community leaders. Public perception also took a turn. What started as a laughing matter began to be defended with pride by many citizens. Radio programs and community meetings discussed not only the practical results, but also the symbolism. Burkina Faso, so often dependent on external aid, was now showing the world its own solution. Young students wrote murals with phrases like burying dependence, cultivating sovereignty, turning the Oasis project into a political slogan. More than an agricultural technique, the initiative took on the air of a social manifesto. Every buried watermelon became a metaphor for resistance and hope. The people saw that the land could be reborn, and along with it, national self-esteem. As the signs of the Oasis project's success accumulated, Ibrahim Traoré saw the opportunity to transform an agricultural experiment into a political banner. In a speech broadcast to the nation, he declared firmly, "If the world will not sell us fertilizers without chains, we will make our own fertility with what the earth already offers us." It was not just a technical phrase. It was a direct challenge to the powers that had kept Burkina Faso dependent on external contracts for decades. The repercussion was immediate. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Protesters painted walls with slogans like "Sovereignty Now" and "Africa waters itself." University students organized debates to discuss how to expand the idea to other agricultural waste, while union leaders applauded the government's courage. For many citizens, Traoré was no longer just a transitional president, but a symbol of African dignity. However, the political reaction also brought risks. The opposition accused the government of staging a spectacle to mask failures in food management and security. Some parties called for investigations into the project's real costs. Polarization grew, but paradoxically, this only increased the centrality of the issue in the national debate. The most impressive was the regional effect. Neighboring governments began sending delegations to closely observe the experimental fields. What began as an attempt at a local response to soil degradation was transforming into a continental platform of contestation against dependence on imports. In the end, every buried watermelon became not only a gesture of science, but a political act. The Oasis project made it clear that Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, no longer accepted being a passive spectator of its own history. The Oasis project quickly became a talking point not only in Burkina Faso, but also in international spheres. Reactions in the West were largely negative, with the United States and the European Union adopting a skeptical, if not hostile, stance. For many political analysts and agricultural experts, the project seemed like a step backward. It is a populist measure and fundamentally a distraction from more complex problems, said American critics. The use of organic waste to restore soil fertility was seen in large part as a short-term solution, without guaranteeing permanent results, or the creation of a sustainable agricultural infrastructure. The Western media's response was cruelly sarcastic. Newspapers and news channels like the New York Times and the BBC ridiculed the act, publishing stories that compared Traoré's initiative to political theater, an attempt to mask the lack of real structural reforms. "Africa is burying its future in the desert," declared one British article. This reaction from the Western media not only underestimated the project's positive impact, but also minimized the African search for self-sustaining solutions. However, the response was not uniform. Other countries viewed the Oasis project through a different lens. Russia, China, and Turkey, for example, hailed the initiative as a sign of resistance against Western dominance over fertilizer markets. Russia compared the act to the country's own history of resistance during times of sanctions and economic difficulties. China, always attentive to innovations in agribusiness, saw the technique as an opportunity to study and perhaps even replicate in more arid regions of its own territory. Turkey, in turn, highlighted the cultural symbolism of the project, associating it with the importance of African traditions and solidarity between peoples. This contrast in reactions illustrates how the view on the Oasis project was divided between those who saw the initiative as a threat to the global economic status quo and those who saw it as a sign of emancipation and self-sufficiency. As the Oasis project gained visibility, the impact on geopolitical relations was undeniable. The reaction of the European Union and the United States, as already mentioned, was predominantly negative, as these powers feared that the initiative would become a replicable model in other African nations, undermining decades of influence over the continent. The idea that African countries could begin to depend less on external fertilizer imports and more on local solutions shook the economic and commercial structures that had been established. The fertilizer industry would become vulnerable to this new approach, and with it, Western dominance over Africa's natural resources. This did not go unnoticed. However, a notable shift was seen in the reactions of Russia and China. Russia soon highlighted the similarities between the Oasis project and its own trajectory of resistance in times of international sanctions. For Russia, the idea of transforming waste into a resource was not only an agricultural strategy, but a way to show strength in the face of external adversities. The Russian press hailed Ibrahim Traoré as a leader who challenged international norms and promoted African sovereignty, something that resonated strongly in a continent that often finds itself hostage to foreign policies. China, with its growing interest in the African continent, also viewed the Oasis project through a more favorable lens. For the Chinese, the idea of recycling local resources and using them to improve agriculture was a proposal aligned with their own policies of sustainability and resource efficiency. It was no surprise that China, already with agricultural cooperation programs in various parts of Africa, saw in the Oasis project an opportunity to collaborate technically, sharing its innovations to tackle similar problems in its arid regions. In contrast, Turkey also embraced the symbolism of the project, associating it with the idea that Africa should seek its own solutions without depending on international aid. Turkey, in its quest for a greater presence in Africa, saw in the Oasis project a movement of intercontinental solidarity, a way of affirming that Africa can and must be self-sufficient. These global reactions highlighted the complexity of the Oasis project. It was not just an agricultural solution, but a political and geopolitical statement that challenged established power relations on the international stage. What began as an attempt to transform a wasted resource into a local agricultural solution soon turned into something much bigger than could be imagined. The Oasis project was not just a reaction to land degradation or a palliative measure against hunger. As positive results began to emerge, green shoots growing where only desert had been the meaning of the project expanded, taking on a much deeper proportion. The real turning point occurred when an internal report leaked by an anonymous source from the European Agricultural Trade Association came to light. The document, in an alarmed tone, described how the large-scale adoption of methods like the Oasis project could devastate the global fertilizer industry. Billions of dollars in annual revenue were at stake as the dependence on imported fertilizers could begin to wither in the face of local solutions, such as composting agricultural waste. This revelation was a direct blow to the economic powers that profited from the dependence of African countries, and the impact was immediate. The Oasis project, until then seen as a low-tech solution to local problems, now became a catalyst for a broader movement against the dependence of African countries on foreign aid. It not only challenged conventional agricultural practices, but also pointed to a new future in which Africa would no longer be a passive victim, but a protagonist in its own narrative. What was initially ignored or ridiculed was now becoming a real threat to global interests. The Sahel Desert, which seemed infertile and powerless, began to flourish as a symbol of resistance. And as African countries took the reins of their own agricultural revolution, the world wondered how far could this new movement go. The Oasis project was not just about watermelons buried in the desert. It was a milestone in the search for African sovereignty, in the fight against dependence, and in the affirmation of the power of an Africa that refuses to be defined by others. With every buried watermelon, Burkina Faso demonstrated that it is possible to reverse centuries of exploitation and poverty using what is at hand and what the earth offers. The Sahel, which many considered a lost region, now re-emerges as a symbol of resistance and innovation. As Ibrahim Traoré stated, "We do not ask permission to be free. We rise up to conquer it." This statement resonated throughout Africa, inspiring a generation to believe that their freedom does not depend on external alliances, but on inner strength and the ability to reinvent their reality. The Oasis project became more than an agricultural solution. It transformed into a political manifestation, a plea for dignity and self-sufficiency. As the first seeds of sovereignty begin to sprout in the African earth, the world begins to see that when a people finds its strength, nothing, not even the desert, can stop it.